Trying to find my way, 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 trying to find my way. I'm trying, change me.
My faith is in God alone, beyond a reasonable doubt. This brainstorm pouring rain on your season of drought. Just trying to lay a couple seeds in the mouth. Thanks for listening. You ever get the feeling you was missing?
What up, y'all? It's your hometown hero, Scott Lane, the Black Bruce Wayne, a.k.a. the real Adam Coleman. So, you riding with Tru-ID. Man, it's been a lot going on, man. Been a lot going on since I last spoke to you guys. I'm excited, man, to just get back from the Frequency Conference up there in Philly. For those of y'all who don't know, the Frequency Conference is a urban ministry conference. It was spearheaded by Dr. Eric Mason. I believe they've been doing that for some years. So Dr. Eric Mason and Epiphany Church have been heading that up. And it's just basically a conference where, individuals who are interested in, so-called urban ministry can come and get equipped, with information in regard to, all sorts of things, man. They had, different breakout sessions on financial management, of course, issues with diversity and racial reconciliation, dealing with, white supremacy and the culture and things of that nature, and as well as also apologetics topics, that particularly pertain to the African-American context, man. So it was like, it was the perfect conference for me, man. Definitely perfect conference for me. Very, very interesting stuff. So got a chance to meet, a bunch of dope people, man. Got a chance to kick it with Eric Mason a little bit. Dr. Jerome Gay, shout out to him. Shout out to just everybody that I ran into, man. We'll get into that in a minute. But interestingly enough, before I even, got out of town, man, to head up to Philly, the adventure already started for me like a day before. Let me back up and let me explain what I mean by that. So, I'm getting ready to get out of town, right? Now I'm excited because I'm like, shoot, man, I get like 2 or 3 days out of town. That means that's, no dirty diapers I got to change, no snotty noses I got to wipe, get a little break. Shout out to the wife, Candace, for letting me get out of town a little bit. So, I'm excited, man. I'm getting prepared. I'm packing clothes, getting ready to go. And, of course, without question, I need to get me an edge up, man. I can't be going out of town looking shabby. I'm representing Tru-ID out here, man. Also representing the King movement. So I can't be walking around looking crazy, So I'm like, go ahead, get to the barbershop, get me a little edge up or whatever. And, I'm real particular about, the barbershops that I go to. You know what I'm saying? Like when I go get my hair cut, I kind of want to be like in a relaxed mode. You know what I mean? I don't really want to be around a lot of foolishness necessarily, so it's just kind of like a real chill time for me. So, and, a couple barbers, I'm relatively new to the place where I live at. So I hadn't really found like that barber that was like that go-to guy, you know what I'm saying? Like the barber, so to speak. Right. And so, I came across a couple weeks ago, this shop I hadn't seen before. And you had like a Christian kind of a name to it. I'm like, all right, cool. You might be some brothers to kick it with or whatever. So, I see some Christian brothers out here trying to, make some money the legal way. I'm gonna go ahead and support, So I'm like, all right, I'm gonna check them out. So the day before I'm getting ready to leave out for the Frequency Conference, I go ahead and check this barbershop out, right? So, I get there, and waiting for a chair. Y'all know how it goes, man. It was a Thursday, so it wasn't too bad, but, had a couple people ahead of me or whatever. And so, I finally catch up with one of the barbers who had some time free or whatever. So I sit in this chair, man, and I'm, I'm a conversational guy, I'm interested in making small talk and stuff, typical barbershop stuff, talk about sports or anything like that. But, dude was just real quiet, man. The barber, he was acting a little weird a little bit. I was like, well, maybe I ruined his afternoon. Maybe he wasn't really trying to cut nobody hair or something like that, but it's all good. So I'm in the chair now. So, it is what it is. So, anyway, after a couple minutes, he asked me about, my dreads, how long you been growing your dreads out, so we're kicking it about that. He's like, I used to wear dreads, I'm all right. That's what's up. So, then he's like, yeah, man, I stopped wearing dreads because I used to get like these heat flashes, And to be honest with you, I'm like, I'm not really all that concerned about hearing about your heat flashes, bro. But if you want to talk about it, we can. But that's not the kind of thing that I expect to be discussing at a barbershop. But all right, okay. So he's like, yeah, but I used to have these heat flashes, so I had to cut my hair, that sort of thing. I'm like, all right, dog, that's what's up. And then so he's like, yeah, man. And then what really helped was spiritual healing. I'm like, okay. So at this point, he's kind of got my attention, right? I'm like, it's a Christian barbershop. And so I asked, like, so you mean like, I'm like, you mean like prayer or something like that? Like, what do you mean? I'm thinking maybe we'll have a conversation about the word or something like that. He said, nah, man. Nah, none of that. I'm into these herbs and spiritual healing. And I'm like, okay. Are we talking about marijuana herb? Or are we talking about, nutritional store kind of herb? Like, what are we talking about here? He said, something like, I was like, word, so what do you mean? He said, man, I'm a Moorish American. And then I was like, okay. Now, for my listeners out there who don't know what that means, a Moorish American, or sometimes you hear them refer to themselves as, the Moors. It's one of these Afrocentric groups that are, I guess, kind of akin to like the Hebrew Israelites or Comedics or what have you. It's one of these main Afrocentric groups in the conscious community that, a lot of people are leaving, or maybe not a lot, but, people are leaving Christianity and hopping into some of these groups. Moorish Americans would be one of these groups. So it's one of these pro-Black, Afrocentric, religions or whatever, that I deal with in some of my writings and obviously here on the Tru-ID podcast. So when he said he was a Moorish American, I'm like, yes, you don't know what he's dealing with, but, it's about to be an interesting conversation, right? So, at this point, I know I got something going. I'm like, okay, cool. We about to get it in on this conversation, right? And so I really want to set the trap now. So I'm like, oh yeah, so so you mean like with Noble Drew Ali, right? Now I know that Noble Drew Ali is a founder of the Moorish American movement. So I throw his name out. So now I really got his attention. Now he's hype. He's like, yeah, definitely, man. That's what's up. Oh, you know about that? I'm like, yeah, I know a little something about it. The whole time I'm getting ready to just like, okay, yeah, this is about to be dope. This is about to be dope. So now let me pause right here and say, that, for me, I used to, get in conversations like these and just, go just hog wild, man, guns blazing, ready to just refute everything, but I'm trying, I'm a little more slick with it now. I'm a little bit more savvy with it. As a matter of fact, for anybody who's been, following the show, you recall a couple episodes ago, we had, Greg Koukl on the show. And Greg Koukl talked about his approach that he developed and outlined in his book called Tactics, where basically he, instructs believers on how to use questions, particularly to navigate conversations about, spirituality and ultimately evangelism using apologetics. And so, in a different way to put it might be that while many times we get equipped with information from an apologetic standpoint, he basically gives you the tools to use a question type format so that you can take this information and put it in the form of argumentation within the context of a conversation, right? So the whole point is to be conversational with apologetics, right? And so that's what Greg Koukl is talking about. And so, matter of fact, if you haven't heard that show, definitely go back 2 episodes here at Tru-ID and check out what he's talking about there. So as a matter of fact, over the last several months, what I've done is I've actually kind of been forming my own, I guess, toolkit, so to speak, of different techniques to use when, ministering apologetics to, unbelievers who are in these kind of Afrocentric belief systems, right? And, maybe I'll call it Blacktics or something like that. Greg Koukl's got Tactics, so I'm gonna call mine Blacktics. I'm gonna see how that works. I'm sure he would appreciate that. But anyway, so he talks about the the importance of asking questions. Greg Koukl does, So going back to the story, as I'm talking to this barber, he told me he's a Moorish American, right? And already I've been using my tactical skills because if you remember what, Greg Koukl was talking about, he talks about the importance of asking questions, right? And he gives you a couple of different reasons for that and, a couple of different ways in which to use questions. So again, at the beginning of this conversation, the guy said he was into spiritual healing. And one of the tactics that Greg Koukl uses is to ask the question, what do you mean by that? And he gives you a couple of different ways or a couple of different reasons to do that. One of them is information gathering, So when this guy says, I'm into this spiritual healing, and I asked him, what do you mean by that? That was my, attempt to say, okay, let me gather some information here. Okay, now either he's going to say something about church and we're going to have a good conversation about the word, or he's going to go somewhere else with it. That might be an opportunity to witness. In this case, it became an opportunity to witness, right? So, so it's all about gathering information, right? Now, I will say this, it's so important that when we get in these conversations with people in the conscious community, right, that we not jump the gun without gathering information first about who we're dealing with. You got to know your audience, right? I think it's particularly the case because, let's say, for example, if you're dealing with a Hebrew Israelite, right, they're going to give you certain types of objections, right, that maybe some other group is not. Like, so, for example, if you're dealing with a person who is a Kemetic, Kemetic is just another word for Egypt. Kemet is just another word for Egypt. And so you have these people who subscribe to these Egyptian myths and all this kind of stuff and Egyptian philosophy. They refer to themselves as Kemetics. Now, whereas a Hebrew Israelite, you might be able to find some common ground to argue from, in the sense that they're going to affirm in one way or the other. They're going to affirm, the validity of the Bible. Whereas a Kemetic, you don't really have that common ground. They don't care nothing about the Bible particularly. So, how you address a Kemetic is going to be different than how you address a Hebrew Israelite, right? So that's why it's so important, to, gain information, before you, launch into, giving refutations or whatever when you encounter people, because it helps you to narrow your target down a little bit and give you a better game plan as to how you want to, inject Christ and apologetics into the conversation, right? So in this case, I'm dealing with a guy who's a Moor. He's a Moorish, into Moorish scientism, what some people refer to it as. Now, actually, I haven't really spent a lot of time dealing with Moors, because they're not as prominent as, say, the Hebrew Israelites or even the Kemetics. Maybe you don't really hear about them quite as much, I don't think. And so I really just haven't invested a whole lot of time, into, learning their doctrines. I know there's some kind of, one way or the other, there's somewhat kind of quasi, Islam, kind of a thing. But, I just haven't really invested a lot of time into studying them that much. So even once, when this guy tells me he's a Moor, he said, hey, man, I'm a Moorish American. At this point, I know that it's something that I want to pursue, but I still want to gain a little bit more information. I want to find, the right target before I really launch into giving a defense for the faith. And so, it just so happens that, he tells me he's a Moorish American, and he starts going on about how he used to be in church and he realized it was a bunch of bull crap and all this kind of stuff. And so I'm just kind of listening, man. I'm just listening, asking more questions. Oh, what do you mean by that? How so? I'm just kind of getting them to talk. And the whole time I'm taking notes in my head as to the arguments that he's making against Christianity. And I'm going to find the right target. So when it's time for me to, respond, I've got myself a little bit of a game plan here. Right. So, eventually he says, yeah, Jesus was based off of Roman myths. I'm like, okay. I think that's going to be my entry point right there. So he's just kind of ranting about, Jesus being based on Roman myths or whatever. And, at that point, I asked him another question, what do you mean by that? At this point, we've probably been talking for maybe 5-10 minutes. And, I've really been asking the same question the whole time, just phrasing it different ways. What do you mean by that? Now, again, at this point, I asked him what he meant. And he just said, well, yeah, it's based off Roman myths, And so, now I'm going to kind of reframe my question a little bit. So I'm going to push him a little bit more than just kind of, broad questions, and ask him, which Roman myth was Jesus based on? Now, at this point, I'm really trying to test him a little bit, right? I want to find out, is this a guy that's really done, research into some pseudo scholarship, and he's going to try to, defend maybe a particular Roman myth? If so, then we can go there, or is he just kind of putting it out there because he's regurgitating what somebody else said? And he really doesn't know. He's just kind of saying it because, he saw it on YouTube or something like that. And so I really want to kind of, plumb the depths of where this guy's coming from. Now, when I ask him which Roman myth, he's referring to, I'm thinking either he's going to refer to Mithra, because actually that was a Roman myth that some people suppose that Jesus was based off of. Now, I happen to know that some of the parallels that people would try to launch against, Jesus, like, that from comparing him to Mithra, I know that those parallels fail because they're not grounded in primary sources. So I already know that, before I ask the question. But then again, I'm thinking, okay, well, if he's not going the Mithra route, then maybe he's just kind of, like I said, regurgitating it, and then I'm just going to give some general, evidences for Christianity at that point. So it turns out that he had no idea which Roman myths, once I asked him, he had nowhere to go after that. So at this point in the conversation, I've got some valuable intel, right? So it's kind of like, I guess, I would use an analogy, like a military analogy. Now, I never served in the military, so I'm kind of basing this off of, video games like Call of Duty and, Metal Gear Solid or something like that. But, before you go charging into battle, you want to make sure that you have some intel. So I got some intel now, right? Been asking some questions, basically the same question over and over again. And what I found out is that this guy is proclaims to be a Moorish American. He's pro-black, and he believes that Jesus was based on Roman pagan myths. That's what I got right now, right? And so I want to take this information that I have, and now I'm going to come up with a game plan. So what am I thinking? Now, this guy believes that that Christianity is the white man's religion, right? So I want to attack that. On the other hand, I also want to address this whole Jesus mythicism issue. And then also, I want to ultimately work my way towards the resurrection, I'm thinking, because, the issue of whether or not Jesus existed is a historical question. And we do have an historical argument for the resurrection. So I'm thinking I can start, since we're talking about history anyway, I can start with the historicity of Jesus and then work my way there. So I come up with this 4-step plan. The first step I took was I hit him with some African church history. I get into how Christianity was in Africa, for about 1,500 years, prior to the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, we talked about how, within the first, by the end of the first century, you already have Christianity moving into places like, North Africa, through some of the kinship networks of the Hebrews who were living there at the time. We talked about how you have the Alexandrian Catechetical School, which is the first theological school anywhere on the planet, because this guy was all about knowledge. He kept stressing the fact that, it's about knowledge, it's about information. And so I hit him with that. I thought that might be of interest to him. You have this Alexandrian, basically a seminary, in Alexandria, Egypt, in or around maybe the 2nd century or so, and then of course, we talked about how Christianity was in ancient Nubia. We talked about that, for from about maybe the 5th century to about the 13th century. If it was close to 1,000 years, you have that in ancient Nubia. So I just hit them with these different facts, to establish the fact that Christianity was in Africa prior to the transatlantic slave trade. Now, in addition to that, just as a matter of rhetorical, impact, I also, just started listing names, of African theologians, whether it be, of course, St. Augustine, Tertullian, Cyprian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Athanasius. I just started, listing names, just to kind of really layer it on thick that, hey, this Christianity thing ain't new as far as Africans are concerned, right? So I hit him with that first, right? But ultimately, I want to deal with his main objection, which was that Jesus was based on a Roman myth. And so, from that point, once I hit him with the African stuff, African church history, then I moved from there. I kind of formulated like a 3-step plan, to address some of his other objections. So what I decided to do, I was wanting to hit up the question about, Jesus existing. Then I was going to move to reliability of the New Testament and then work my way to the resurrection. So this is kind of the game plan that I plotted out. I start talking about, the African church history. And then by the time I get to the, his point about the Roman mythology, I said, hey, man, we have rational justification to affirm that Jesus existed, with or without the Bible. Now, what I typically do here is you have to stress for people, right? You have to stress for people that when I say that Jesus existed, I'm not making a theological or a biblical claim. And so, most of the time I'll even go overboard and say it a couple of different ways that what I'm talking about is pure history from a historical standpoint. There is more than enough evidence to affirm that Jesus existed, right? So, as I've come up with this 3-part argument that I'm launching into, before I even go there, I'm hammering home that, hey, I'm not hitting you with, because the Bible tells me so. I'm coming from a historical standpoint. Now, I believe that the Bible is inerrant. I do believe that the Bible is, powerful and all that it is. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'm starting, from history, and I'm working them towards where I want the listener to be, right? So I hit him with that, right? So I hit him, so I gave him examples. I'm like, man, even if I didn't have the Bible, if I had no Bible, I could still affirm that Jesus existed, right? And he's like, well, how so? I'm like, cool. I'm glad you asked. So at this point, I'm like, okay, well, I can show you examples of ancient Roman historians who are reporting that this Jesus is a real person. And I explained to him, how early testimony works, because the reality is a lot of times people, they study history, but they don't really know how historians come to the conclusions that they come to, So in order for me to present this argument in a way that he's really going to grasp the weight of it, I have to sometimes narrate a little bit. I have to kind of walk him through the argument. And so normally I'm not just going to jump straight into, oh well, Tacitus said this or Tacitus said that. I want to illustrate first why the source I'm about to give you is as powerful as it is. As a matter of fact, I can use an analogy here. Like, it's kind of like with this Colin Kaepernick situation. I'm not going to get into the race aspect of it right now, but in terms of, from a statistical standpoint, some people will make the argument for him being in the league, and they might say something like, well, last year he had a 90.7 passer rating, and he had a 16-4 ratio between touchdowns and, interceptions, or, his passing completions was like 59%. To somebody who understands quarterback statistics, they might be impressed by that. But if you don't know anything about football, if you don't know what a good passer rating is, or if you don't know what a good interception to touchdown ratio is, then those statistics aren't really going to mean anything to you. There's not going to be any weight to them, right? So likewise, sometimes when we have information, we have to first explain to people, what constitutes good evidence versus bad evidence, before we even get into the evidence at all. Otherwise, they really won't see the weight of the evidence that we present, right? And so in this case, I start, explaining to them that when historians of ancient history begin to look for the historicity of a person or an event, number one, they're not looking for they're not looking for certainty. It's not they're not trying to prove for certain that this or that happened. They're looking for, a high probability. They want to find evidences that strengthen the case that this person or this event is historical, right? And so when we consider it that way, one of the things that they would look at is early testimony. And for ancient history to have a source within, say a century or so, maybe even 2 centuries, depending on what you're dealing with, constitutes reliable history or a reliable source, right? So, then I'm going to get into Tacitus a little bit. I'm going to explain that you have this Roman historian, named Tacitus, who's writing his work called Annals in about 112 AD, and who mentions Christ, again, within 100 years of Jesus's reported life, right? And so, that's the beauty of Google, man, is that, I could Google it right on my phone. So I pulled it up right on my phone, and I'm about to read, and I read him this passage. Matter of fact, I'm gonna read it for you guys right now. Let me pull it up here. Got it right here. So, so this is Tacitus, in from his work entitled Annals, writing in about 112 to 116 AD. And he says, quote, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, but as of hatred of mankind. Now, so, end quote. So I read him this passage. I'm like, well, just listen to it. You got a guy named Christus, and I just kind of walk him through the passage. You have Christus mentioned, obviously that's Christ. You have Pontius Pilate mentioned. Now, we're not dealing with a biblical source here. We're not dealing with scripture. This is a non-biblical source. But so far, we got Christ and Pontius Pilate. And then we also have, this writer Tacitus. I mean, clearly he's no friend to Christianity. He called it a mischievous superstition. He called these people, these Christians, an abomination. So for those sorts of reasons, the fact that you have this early testimony, you have, specific information that we can find in other sources, and you have, this person who's obviously no friend of Christianity reporting that, about Christ and the beginning of this Christian movement. Those are the kinds of things that a historian will look at and be like, man, I think this source is a reliable attestation of, Jesus having existed. And, so that's just one of them. We could talk about, Josephus. I could have got into that. I could have talked about Pliny the Younger, those are just non-biblical sources. Right. And so we could have got into all that. But, my point was, with him, I only, I think it was about halfway through my haircut at this point. And so I wanted to kind of keep it short, but I at least wanted to give him that quote to chew on. And so at this point in the conversation, man, I mean, I'm only in step one of my three-part argument here, moving towards the resurrection, and I got his attention now. I'd asked him if it was cool if I read him the Tacitus quote, and he's like, "Yeah, man, definitely, man. Yo, what you got?" And let me just pause here for a second and say, is I think that sometimes just being knowledgeable about the faith is in itself a witness, because the reality is, let's be real. Let's be real. When you're dealing with people from the conscious community, they're so used to dealing with Christians who don't know their own belief system that they just expect to kind of railroad Christians, in conversations like these, right? What they expect to happen is, let's say, for example, like, let's say you're on Facebook, right? And, you might have a bunch of Christians talking about something. You're going to have that troll, that conscious community troll that thinks they're going to just jump in the mix, say some stuff about Christianity, and Christians are gonna rebuke them in Jesus' name, which I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with it, but or just kind of throw scripture at them, and they expect us to be these Bible beaters with no intellectual substance to this faith that we hold to. And so what happens is, when they run into a Christian who really is knowledgeable, whether they acknowledge it or not, it does something. It does something. Because the thing of it is, if you're under the impression that you have like this intellectual superiority over Christians, and that's kind of something that you use as a justification to not be a Christian, and then you run into somebody who knows more than you do and kind of suns you on something, then that's going to stick with you for a while. It's just like what Greg Koukl said in his interview that we did, is that, in these conversations, what you want to do is you want to put a stone in somebody's shoe. Whether or not they may not just break down and confess Jesus right at that time, but you want them to come away from it, with something that just really sticks with them, that they just can't shake. And I think that what happens is when you have a Christian who's knowledgeable and can speak to, some of the concerns that they have or questions that they have from a historical standpoint, maybe a philosophical standpoint, it's something about that. They might even get irritated by it at first, but they may not even remember exactly what you say, but they're going to remember that they had an experience with a knowledgeable Christian, and that's going to stick with them. I think for at least many, if not most people. I mean, the other side is if you have somebody who's left the Christian faith, like this gentleman here, he said he grew up in church, and he believes that Christianity is the white man's religion. He may not have ever heard of some of the folks that I previously mentioned, like Tertullian and Augustine and so forth, Cyril and whoever else. Now, if he's never heard of these things, if he's never heard that Christianity was in Africa prior to the transatlantic slave trade, now I've given him this information, that's going to stick with him. It's like, dang, man, I left Christianity because it's the white man's religion, but now I got this information. It's like, well, dog, I missed a spot. Wait a minute here. It's something I got to go back and take a look at. And that's what you want to do. I mean, just at least, if you can at least give somebody something to think about and to take with them, then I think you've done your job. It's just like Scripture says, you have one that sows a seed, one that waters, but God gives the increase. You may not necessarily always be the one to lead that person to Christ, but if you can give people an experience with a knowledgeable Christian that's just really cutting at some of the assumptions that they have, whether, it be, Christians are dumb or Christianity is the white man's religion. If you can just sow some seeds there, then you've done a great job. So anyway, so at this point in the conversation, I've already knocked down 2 of his arguments. I've already knocked down the whole white Christianity is a white religion thing, white man's religion. I've already addressed, that there is evidence by which we can rationally affirm that Jesus existed, even without using the Bible. And so then from there, my next step is going to be to get into a little bit of textual criticism. Now, ultimately, I'm trying to get to the resurrection. That's my home run right there, right? But before I get there, I want to round, third plate, I guess you could say, and hit him with some manuscript evidence. Because what I'm thinking in the back of my mind at this point is, I want to hit him with the resurrection. If I can get there, then I want to be able to double back and, be in a good position to get into some scriptures, in order to really preach the gospel to him. So I kind of want to set the stage for that. And so, before I get to the resurrection, like I said, I want to get into a little bit of manuscript evidence, right? And so, what I mean by that is, I start narrating again, narrating my argument and explaining to him, the types of things the historians and textual critics take into account in order to, arrive at a conclusion about how reliable a text is. I want him to see, why, I rationally affirm that the New Testament is a reliable source for Jesus' life and teachings, right? What he said and what he taught and what he did, So I hit him off a little bit. I explained to him how I gave him an example, which is a pretty common one that I've heard other people use. I remember reading Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, when I was a kid in school. So I just assumed, I guess, maybe everybody doesn't read it, but I just assume it's just a text that people commonly read in school. So I asked him, have you ever heard of Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey? And he's like, yeah, definitely heard of that. And so I explained to him that, archaeologists have unearthed, about between 700 to 1,000 or so manuscripts and manuscript fragments, so text, your actual physical text with, the Iliad and Odyssey written on it. So, about 1,000 or so, of those texts. And from that, they conclude, by comparing the texts with one another that they can find discrepancies and then, in a sense, kind of make corrections and ultimately arrive at, what they believe the original Iliad and the Odyssey, look like, what it actually said. And so, archaeologists textual critics would say that, from the number, the 1,000 or so manuscripts that they have, they can determine that the Iliad and Odyssey is about as accurate to the original, maybe to the degree of maybe 95% or so. So I kind of set that up. I'm like, okay, that's pretty good, right? So he's rocking with me. He understands where I'm at. And so then I shift over to the New Testament. I said, now compare that to the New Testament. Right. So whereas with the Iliad and the Odyssey, we have about 1,000 manuscripts. And, from that, we can derive, that we can conclude that we have a really reliable account of what Homer's work said. With the New Testament, we have about 5,800 or so, well, about 5,800 Greek manuscripts and manuscript fragments, right? About 5,800. Okay. Now, that's just in the Greek. I explained to him that that's just in the Greek. The New Testament was originally written in Greek with, maybe some possible exceptions might be the book of Matthew, possibly, the book of Hebrews. But, by and large, most scholars would agree that most likely the New Testament was written in Koine Greek. Koine is a particular dialect of ancient Greek, right? So just in the Greek manuscripts alone, we have about 5,800 Greek manuscripts and manuscript fragments of the New Testament. Now, I draw that parallel. I say, okay, now, if from 1,000 manuscripts and manuscript fragments that we have for Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, these historians will say that, textual critics will say that we have an accurate account of what is said to about 95% or so. How much more then? If we have 5 times, close to 6 times as many of these fragments and manuscripts for the New Testament, how much more then can we attest to the reliability of the New Testament? And that's just the Greek. And then add on top of that, because once you understand that you have different translations in the early centuries of the church of the New Testament, whether it be in Coptic or Syriac might be some examples. Obviously then Latin as well. Once you start adding in these different translations, then when you're talking about ancient manuscripts, now you're getting up to about 25,000 manuscripts and manuscript fragments. So again, if the average historian will regard Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey as being credible in terms of what it originally said, and can say, well, we can reliably know what it said, then how much more than for the New Testament can we say that we have a reliable account of what the New Testament originally said? As a matter of fact, from what I've read in sources, and actually I'm going to tag, I'm going to put some links here in the description to kind of give you guys a resource for what I'm saying here. But my understanding is that, we can confidently say that we understand, that we know what the New Testament said to about 99.99%, accuracy. Well, that's pretty daggone good. And I would challenge anybody, of these other conscious community religions or belief systems or whatever, to find me a comparable source, to the New Testament upon which they base their beliefs. So for example, I ain't gonna pick on them, but just as a side note, like the Comedics always want to talk about like the Book of the Dead or the Papyrus of Annie and so on and so forth. Okay, cool. What kind of textual evidence do you have of that? Now I know you got to pull from different funerary texts and coffin texts and pyramid texts and this text and that text. All together. Bringing them together. What kind of textual evidence do you have for that? Anyway, I'm gonna leave that alone. So at this point, explain that to him, and now I'm getting to my home run, man. I'm getting to the resurrection, right? And so what's interesting at this point in the conversation, I look around and I notice that the barbershop has gotten kind of quiet at this point. I kind of just been talking, man. Like once I got into my argumentation, I just started going for it, man. And I started to think back to the beginning of the conversation when the gentleman said that he was a Moorish American. He kind of said it under his breath. Now, like I said, this is a Christian barbershop, so I'm assuming that maybe they kind of weren't too welcoming to his perspective. Maybe he had been, talking against the church, maybe just kind of tired of it or whatever. But I kind of got the impression that he was trying to keep that part of the conversation under wraps. But evidently, I can be somewhat of a loud talker sometimes, So as I'm getting into my, argumentation, by the time I get to the evidence for the New Testament, manuscript evidence for the New Testament, I noticed that everybody else is just like I said, just quiet, but it's all good though. It's all good. I'm like, maybe somebody else needed to hear what I had to say, So I keep going, man. I keep going. I get into the resurrection, and I'm not going to get into the full argument here. As a matter of fact, for anybody who's interested in a detailed defense of the resurrection from a historical standpoint, you can always go back a couple episodes here at Tru-ID and check out my man Cameron Bertuzzi. He broke it down real good for us, man. A historical argument for the resurrection. And actually, there's a couple different ways you can run that argument. So I gave him kind of the condensed version, if you will. So you have this book that I've been, definitely vibing on here lately, man. It's by Dr. Gary Habermas and Dr. Mike Licona, called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, man. It's a really solid book. And it outlines what they call the minimal facts argument for the resurrection, right? And so, the basis of it is that you take a number of facts surrounding the resurrection that historians believe to be, well attested and, quite plausibly historical, right? And so, for example, let me just kind of lay out. I think that, they vary in the number of how many they lay out, but, they have 5 in the book. So I'll just kind of give you a kind of a quick bullet points of these. So the first one would be that Jesus was crucified at the hands of the Romans. That's number 1. Number 2, Jesus' disciples had experiences which they believed to be encounters with the bodily resurrected Jesus. Number 3, you have the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus, to Christianity. Number 4, you have the conversion of Paul to Christianity. And then number 5, we have the tomb of Jesus was discovered empty by a group of his female followers. Now, what's interesting about that, when I get to this point of in this resurrection argument, I always like to specify that these 5 facts, I'm not making faith statements here. These are not faith statements. These are statements about history. When we talk about, the crucifixion, the empty tomb, the disciples had experiences, these facts are widely regarded amongst historians, professional historians, as being historically credible statements about history. As a matter of fact, with Gary Habermas and Mike Licona in their book, what they noticed that for those first 4 facts that I laid out, upwards of 90%, over 90% of professional historians today would affirm, that those facts, have a high degree of historical probability. Okay. And then even with the empty tomb, they would say that 2/3 of professional historians today would affirm that the tomb was indeed empty, as the Gospels record. Now, that's just fascinating. Like, we're so used to hearing these things, about the crucifixion and the resurrection. We're so used to hearing these things within the context of a church service, like an Easter sermon or something like that, that, when we talk about this, about the resurrection, we automatically kind of jump to like spiritual mode, right? But here, what I'm doing is I'm saying that from a purely historical standpoint, we have good reason, we have rational justification to affirm these 5 facts. Now, the thing of it is, just kind of make a long story short, and I actually taught about this recently at No Ceilings, and so what I might do is see if I can rip the audio from that, and then just post it as a podcast. But ultimately, when you take these 5 facts, you want to, give an explanation as to, what best explains these 5 facts. And, when you post up different, naturalistic theories, no naturalistic theory can give an account for all 5 facts. Whereas, there is indeed a theory that can account for it, which is obviously the hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead by the power of God, So, I hit him with that, man. I hit him with the argument for the resurrection, right? So at this point, I think he's just impressed at this point, man. I mean, like I said, a lot of people are just not used to Christians engaging them on an intellectual level, So he's just about finished with my haircut. It's about time for me to dip out. And it's cool. Like the whole conversation has shifted at this point to whereas before, he's kind of just grumbling about Christianity being the white man's religion and, just being, Christianity being just bull crap in his words, to at the end of the conversation, he's like, yo, man, please come back and see me, enjoy the conversation. You know what I mean? Definitely, appreciate you sitting there and talking to me and all. And he was just real cool about it, man. Real cool. Just really seemed to, make an impression on him, and so what I learned from that is, just kind of, walking my way through that is the power of just being a Christian, of being equipped, and being ready at all times to give a defense for the faith. Because the reality is, man, you just never know who you're going to come across. You never know who you're going to come across. And that's why this apologetics is so important, man. And not just apologetics, but really having a firm grasp of the gospel so you can be ready to go at all times. So that's how my weekend started out, man. Before I even hit the road, to go to this frequency conference, I'm already got things popping off. And so, get up with my man, Corey Goss, we ride up to Philly, shout out to him, definitely, man. And, we just, we get there, man. And I tell you what, I'm going to say off top, man, one thing I appreciated, as we get to the frequency conference is cats are starting on time. I ain't trying to paint a stereotype, man, but I've been to many a conference in my day, I ain't old like that, but, I've been to many a conference in my day, and we not always the best when it comes to starting on time. I've been to conferences, man, where like literally every breakout session, every main event is starting like, 4 or 5 hours late, which is hard to imagine, but it actually happened. So thank God for Christians who start on time. We get there, man, and shoot, man, I tell you what, they spark it off with praise and worship, boy. It was turning up. It was live off top, man, and so it was just a really cool atmosphere. A lot of people there, man. I want to say they had about 1,000 folks in the building. Definitely a lovely facility. And, yeah, man. So, by the time we got into the first main session, I was hyped, man. I was ready to go, man. So, Dr. Eric Mason gets up there, man, tore it down, bro. Tore it down, definitely. Some people saw that I, comment on Facebook is definitely one of the top sermons I've ever heard preached. And I'm not even exaggerating. I'm not the kind of person to be just hyping stuff up or be excitable, but I really meant that, man. It was some powerful stuff. And, he was pretty much setting the tone for the theme of the whole conference, which was woke church, and so he was just kind of laying out, what that means. And, it's just so interesting, man. Like, one thing, and anybody who's been following the show, I've kind of harped on this before, is just how important it is to engage, where African Americans are as a matter of discipleship in terms of giving them a biblical framework to navigate the racial terrain, so to speak, that we have to navigate in America, And one thing I appreciate about the Woke Church Frequency Conference is that just from start to finish, I felt like, what was going on is there was certainly like this equipping where you have a biblical worldview and just tools being added to people's toolbox from a biblical worldview so that they could then go out and engage society being their African American selves or their white selves, because we had white folks there too, we had Hispanics there, but just whoever you were, having the tools and resources from within the Christian worldview to engage the broader society, which is so saturated with the just an infection of racism, I guess maybe I put it that way, So it was just really dope, man. And so I thought that off top, Dr. Eric Mason really set it off. He came out of Ephesians 5, I think it was 5:14, I want to say. And he was talking about just the different levels of being woke. And it's just really fascinating, man. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go there right quick. What he was dealing with is just basically how you have different aspects of being woke. And I think what he said was one of them is being aware of your, how you're perceived by white folks as an African American. Now, I think it's very fascinating. And what's interesting is I think that when you start having these conversations, immediately people get uncomfortable, but I appreciate the fact that in this atmosphere, there was just open talk about things that are on people's minds, because whether people get uncomfortable about it or not, these are the kinds of conversations, or I could say maybe the kinds of concerns that people have on their hearts. And then maybe in some arenas, they don't feel comfortable talking about it, And one thing I think I've said on this show before, that if we're not dealing with issues of race within the context of the church, within the context and process of discipleship, then we shouldn't expect anything other than for believers to go elsewhere to seek answers. That's just what it is. It's just like, with my kids, like, if I don't teach them about sex at the appropriate time, then they're going to hear about it somewhere. They're going to hear about it from, the kids at school or, whoever else. They're going to hear about it from somebody, And so I think what you have is, unfortunately, Christians have not been engaging the issue of race from a biblical standpoint in a way that people can then, leave the church doors, so to speak, Monday through Saturday, navigate what I call that racial terrain. And so what happens is when they, get Monday morning or, Monday evening, they're scrolling through their news feed, they haven't been getting answers that they need in these areas, but the Hebrew Israelites have an answer, or the Comedics have an answer, or the Moors have an answer. And so what we find is that people are attracted to that and then thus looking to these other worldviews for answers. So I appreciated the fact that the Woke Church Frequency Conference was, really committed to addressing these types of things head on in a way that was relatable, biblical, logical, and practical. So it was just dope, man. But yeah, so, talking about, Dr. Eric Mason talking about understanding how white people see us. And man, I could just, I think it really touches a chord, for African Americans. I mean, I look at myself, matter of fact, not too long ago, maybe a couple months ago, I was reading an article online by this, Asian person, or maybe it was like a video or something like that, where they were saying that it's irritating for them when, as an Asian person, people assume that they're smart and good at mathematics, And I mean, I'm not trying to be insensitive, but I mean, like, to me, I'm like, that's a pretty good problem to have. I'm 99.9% sure that I've never had an experience where somebody looked at me as a big black guy and said, "Hey man, yo, you must be pretty smart, big black man like yourself." Now that's never happened. This never happened. Now, people assuming that I'm a criminal, yeah, definitely had that. Drug user, for sure, yeah, definitely had that. Maybe an athlete. People have made that assumption. Those are the types of things that I've experienced. But somebody that assuming based upon my color and size that as a big black man I'm probably smart. No, I can't ever say that I've had that experience. But it's just so fascinating, man. I mean, narratives count for something. Narratives count for something, and I think that one thing that we underappreciate in this country, and that's probably not even the right word, but just maybe underestimate might be a better way to put it, is the depth of depravity that was present in this country as it relates to the interactions between white folks and black folks as the Western world was established. I mean, you had this perception going around that black people were literally less than human, that they were, or at best they were like adult children. I mean, this is where things were, for the most part, and obviously through the abolition movement and civil rights and stuff, to be honest, ultimately I think that the central battle for African Americans, people of African descent in the Western world, more broadly, has been the battle for personhood and perception. I think that's really what it revolves around. Even now, it's just interesting. A couple of months ago, was it back in February? I think it was maybe the first week in February or so. Donald Trump was having his press conference for Black History Month, and he made some comments about Frederick Douglass that seemed to indicate that he really had no clue as to who Frederick Douglass was, and it almost sounded like to some extent that he was under the impression that Frederick Douglass was still alive. It's kind of like a bizarre comment that he made. But it was pretty clear that he didn't really know much about Frederick Douglass, and he caught a lot of flack for it. Now, I bombed on him for it too. But then I thought about it. I'm like, like how would Donald Trump know about Frederick Douglass? Like how would he know? I mean, when you think about it, Donald Trump's about 70 years old. Schools weren't integrated until maybe the mid to late 70s. Maybe mid 70s. I mean, I want to say the Brown versus Board of Education was somewhere in the 1950s, maybe 53, 55, something like that. So, whereas schools were legally desegregated somewhere in the 50s or what have you, we still see in the legislation, we still see as late as like 1972, 76 or something like that, the courts putting into place mandated, busing practices to really integrate the schools, because even though you had integration from a legal standpoint, through the Brown versus Board of Education, because of housing segregation, these people, black and white people still didn't live in the same area, so you didn't have the integration fully, until busing practices were implemented to really bring that about in the mid to late 70s, maybe mid 70s. And so, on top of that, you don't have a Black History Month until, somewhere in the 70s. I think before then you had like a Black History Week and maybe a day or something like that. But you don't really have a nationally recognized Black History Month until the 70s. And so I said all that to say is that, when Donald Trump was coming up in school, he didn't need Black history. I seriously doubt that they were studying Frederick Douglass, all that much, and wherever Donald Trump went to school, and just people of his age bracket, right? I seriously doubt it. And honestly, much of what would be considered history to me, Black history to me, I mean, he's old enough to where he would have lived through it, so it wouldn't be history to him. Black history to him would have been, he would have had to reach back to people like, maybe Marcus Garvey, and that kind of era. And he definitely wasn't learning about Marcus Garvey, I'm sure. But my point is, he probably grew up, he didn't hear anything about Black history. As a matter of fact, I suspect that most white people over maybe 40 years old, maybe 50 years old, I'd say definitely over 50 years old, most of them probably didn't get a whole lot of Black history either. If you went to a segregated school, where you didn't interact with any Black folks, and then on top of that, I seriously doubt they were forcing you to learn much about African Americans. I mean, you probably just didn't get that, So maybe I'll get some hate mail on that, man. People can come back at me on that one. Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear for some white folks who are, say, 50 and above. You know, if you want to hit me up on the email at Scott Lane, Tru-ID7 @gmail.com. And yeah, let me know if I'm off base here, man. I mean, I think that's kind of interesting right there. Like, basically what I'm saying is, if you have, Caucasians who did not learn Black history, when they were coming up, and understandably so, obviously before desegregation and before you had really mixing of the races in the educational setting to where that could give rise to that kind of learning. Then it seems to me that it's kind of hard to know a people group if you don't know the people's history, right? I would say, that plus, being stacked on with the fact that you're not really interacting, back in the day, obviously during housing segregation, all those kind of things, you don't really have Black and white people interacting in social settings other than maybe the work setting, which is kind of more like a, boxed in, limited social setting. It's not just one of those, let your hair down, be who you be type settings. And so I think that, lack of knowledge in terms of Black history, lack of interaction, kind of creates a divide. And, it's kind of like this. I mean, I'm kind of wondering how, that plays out in society, right? I mean, because if you don't understand my story, if you don't know my story, then you're not going to have as full of a framework by which you can understand, what I do or why I do what I do and why I say what I say, But the more you know about my story, then the more informed you're going to be about me and, how I am. And I think that what you have is, if there's this unfamiliarity, in terms of white folks not really, knowing much about Black people, then I'm kind of wondering how that plays out. I mean, because it's like, even in stuff that what we see on the news, we see these protests and, African Americans saying this or that is the problem. Well, if you don't really know the story, if you don't know the backstory, if you don't have that context, then, well, basically, a concern, when somebody expresses a concern, if you have a concern without a context, then it's just basically, it sounds like a complaint. You know what I mean? And nobody likes complaining. People get tired of hearing them complaining. But I think, it's easy to interpret something as being merely a complaint when you don't have a context to understand the concern, if that makes sense, or on the other hand, I mean, like, again, if you have people like Donald Trump and, somewhere in their age range who are in positions of power, and don't really understand their constituents, their African-American constituents, because they don't know the story, and maybe they haven't had the types of interactions that would allow for them to have, that sort of understanding, then I think what happens is from that distance, people, tend to rely upon, narratives and just these passed down perceptions to fill in the gaps of what they don't know about people that they haven't been around, So I'm just kind of curious about that, man. That's somewhat off the subject, but, my whole point is that, getting back to what Dr. Eric Mason was saying is that having an awareness of, how white folks view Black folks. I mean, it's a necessary awareness to have as an African American, just quite frankly, I know, me growing up, my parents would always say, like, hey, we don't have anything against, any color, we don't care who you marry or anything like that, but you can't be out here naive. You have to understand the society that you live in, and you have to be, prepared as to how you need to kind of, work within that, how you need to handle that, can't be out here. It's just like what Jesus said, when he was sending the disciples out, he says, I send you out among ravening wolves, be wise as a serpent, but harmless as a dove. Unfortunately, there's some, racialized ravening wolves, still present in society. And to have to be a well-rounded person who's able to be successful in the society, you have to have an awareness of that, So anyway, then Dr. Mason talked about the second level of being woke, which is being aware of oneself, how you view yourself, And I thought back to, again, to my childhood. I can kind of look at my own story. And my parents were very dedicated to us learning about Black history outside of school. But when I think about what we learned in school, I mean, Black history wasn't really hitting on a whole lot, man. I mean, it's just really sad. it's just really sad how imbalanced, our education is, when it comes to the history of this country, and then specifically with African Americans. I mean, pretty much what you're taught. I mean, black people just started on the cotton fields, some kind of way. That's the beginning of our history. And, even when we get to civil rights, I mean, everything that we learn in school about black history is taught within the context of being subjugated, and, that's no way to formulate a self-concept. There's no way to formulate a self-concept, right? This is very fast. Matter of fact, y'all cats know I rhyme a little bit. At least used to rhyme back in the day. I had this one line where I said, how did joint go? It's such a shame to see so many peers and slaves. Well, go figure. All they know is we came here as slaves, and school books mostly portrayed us in fields and chains as first grade through high school, 12 years a slave. That's real, man. I mean, it's just so that was my experience. That was my experience. And I think that's a problem. It's definitely a problem. There's no way to build a self-concept. But anyway, so then he talked about, how we see ourselves, and kind of flows from that. But then definitely, man, gets into, I guess, the centerpiece, which is how God sees us, and how to see ourselves through that God's eye view, right? And it's so crucial, man. It's so crucial because I think that, I mean, when you just think about the way that the race concept that has so just saturated our thinking and how we view the world, when you think about how that concept came about and when it came about, when it really emerges as being in the forefront of how people view the world, you see that it develops parallel, to the colonization of the Western world. And as a mechanism of imperialism and colonization, this race concept has always been intertwined with, and at least up to this point, inseparable from power and how people are valued, and social status, and who gets what benefits. I mean, it's always been tied with those things, right? So when I think about just the idea of, and this coincides with Tru-ID, it's right in line with Tru-ID, but, what Dr. Eric Mason was teaching on it is understanding one's identity from a God's eye view. And like he says, that you're not really woke until you are awakened to God and find yourself and your identity rooted and grounded in him. And in a practical sense, I see that because, like I said, with this race concept being so rooted, or intertwined rather with power, value, how people are valued, and so on. It's like, we, in order, to live a victorious life, to kind of borrow that phraseology from my Word of Faith brothers and sisters, to live a victorious life, you really do need this awakening to Christ to transcend this world system that is so imbued with racial prejudice and this racial baggage that is held, really not just black people, but just, I think, mankind in bondage, right? And so you have all these people walking around talking about they woke, because they watched a couple YouTube videos, they watched Sinetta TV, or they watched, Ray Hagan's, a couple of videos, and now they woke, right? They have awakened to themselves. But what they don't realize is what most of them mean by woke is that they now have an awareness of who they are, and they've stepped into who they are, right? Now, the problem is this, and I've said it in a previous podcast, there's more to who you are than, comes about with an awareness of your cultural self or your ethnic self. There's more to who you are than that. There's a deeper sense of there's a deeper foundation of your identity. And as a matter of fact, I want to read you guys something right quick. This is actually part from an article that I wrote recently. I'm just going to read a snippet, just a little bit, just a couple paragraphs from this article that I wrote in response to the Charlottesville riots that we had fairly recently. I wrote a 3-part series on it at freethinkingministries.com, so you can definitely check that out. But I just want to kind of read you a portion of it so you can kind of see what I mean or just maybe get a better sense of where I'm coming from. So I said, starting here, over the last few years, I've devoted quite a bit of time digging into the spiritual implications of what I believe to be a sort of identity crisis in the Black community. I began studying the topic of Black identity with the assumption that from the time that Europe began to colonize the Western world till now, quote unquote, Black identity is something that has been in constant process of reconstruction against the backdrop of a fixed and clearly understood sense of identity which centered around Europeanness and whiteness. I was wrong about that. I've now come to realize that the identity problem that first caught my attention within the African American context isn't just a Black thing, after all. It is a feature of the fallen state of mankind, and if you look hard enough, you will find it popping up in the strangest of places. I would say that an erroneous concept of identity was at the heart of what went terribly wrong at the Unite the Right protests in Charlottesville. To ask, who am I, is to engage one of life's biggest questions, and how we answer it can have profound implications. For that reason, I think we should take identity claims more seriously than we typically do. If the biblical worldview is correct, then there is a, quote, fact of the matter, which serves as a foundation and guidepost for understanding who we are and where we stand in relation to others. Now, it seems to me that when we make the centerpiece of our identity something that diverges from that guidepost, then we find ourselves out of step with the world as it really is. And in the same way that denying the existence of gravity won't prevent you from falling to your doom if you jump out of a plane without a parachute, holding to a worldview in which the base of your identity is out of alignment with that identity guidepost will be problematic for you. I think this becomes evident when we consider how concepts of identity seem to intersect with morality. For example, if there is anything that the Holocaust, chattel slavery, and America's strange fruit should have taught us, it is that it is impossible to debase fellow human beings and disregard the intrinsic moral worth they possess without ourselves becoming something less than human in the process. I said should have taught us instead of has taught us, due to the fact that as I write this article, abortion clinics across the nation are murdering and dismembering human children because many in society continue to entertain the falsehood that they are merely a clump of cells or are on some other grounds undeserving of basic human rights. Now, who we understand ourselves to be and where we believe we stand in relation to others informs how we navigate the moral reality that undergirds society and is fundamental to the human experience more broadly. Identity claims really matter. So that's kind of the end of that quote there. That was from an article I wrote entitled Charlottesville of Blood and Soil. And you can definitely check that out at, like I said, freethinkingministries.com. And, the point I'm kind of making here, coming back to Dr. Eric Mason's point that he made in that first sermon, is that if you're only woke on a human level, then you're not woke enough. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, man. So, that's how I started out, man. And it just kept going strong from there, man. I mean, just some phenomenal breakout sessions. I mean, I wish I could have gone to all of them. I ended up going to this one with Paul Tripp that was definitely dope. He did a phenomenal job just talking about racial reconciliation, the fresh perspective that I hadn't heard before. Of course, Dr. Carl Ellis, yo. Dr. Carl Ellis, man, when I say he dropped some bombs, yo, yo, like it was just, it was just one of them joints where just mind blowing type stuff. Matter of fact, I would definitely recommend that anybody needs to go ahead and get the video, not even just the audio. You got to get the video because he has a pretty dope slideshow to help to illustrate his points. But I mean, really, he was dealing with, I can't even do it justice, to be honest with you. I don't even know why I'm trying, but he was talking about just the, pretty much how white supremacy crept into the church, here in the Western world, and he really broke it down theologically and sociologically. And I'm just not even going to say anything more about that, because I'm not going to do it justice. But you know what? Actually, no, I'll take that back. I will say this. I will say this. I was kind of thinking about it, and just kind of throw it in there, just like my own little spin on it. But I'm thinking about when you look at American history, right, and you look at how the church did become so infected with the sin of racism, which allowed for racism in the broader society to continue as long and as strong as it has. Just kind of really been thinking about that, and that scripture came to mind. I'm gonna have to do some more exegesis on it, but the scripture came to mind where Jesus, makes the I guess you could say a rebuke to the Pharisees that the traditions of men make the word of God to null effect. And for anybody who's not familiar with the scene, I think it's Mark chapter 7, where the disciples are about to eat, and the Pharisees come to Jesus like, "Yo, like, how you gonna let the disciples eat without washing their hands?" Now, just on a I mean, obviously they didn't know about germ theory back then, but I mean, it is kind of nasty though, but they were coming at it from a whole different perspective. For them, for the Pharisees, it was a matter of the oral law. It was a matter of the traditions that had been passed down, among the Jews. And it wasn't a Mosaic law, but it was, I think, what they call the oral law. And so what's interesting is that Jesus says he rebukes them in the context of citing what they called the Korban rule at the time. Now, the Korban rule was an oral tradition that had been passed down, where if you had say a certain amount of money, you could pledge it to the temple in lieu of giving it to your parents. Now, of course, the Bible says, the Mosaic law dictated that you ought to honor your father and your mother. Now, when we think about that word honor, we typically think of respect or something like that. But in Judaic terms, it had more of a financial sense to it. You ought to honor it as in take care of them as well. There's an action and financial commitment to it. But what was happening was, instead of honoring thy father and thy mother in like this financial sense, what you had people doing was appealing to the oral law, not the law of Moses, but the oral law, to declare that their finances were pledged to the church. So they would declare the word was korban. And so what Jesus was saying is that you take the oral law and you pledge korban, and then thereby don't take care of your parents, which is violating the actual law, the Mosaic law, the law that came from God. So therefore, this tradition of korban is making the word of God, the actual word of God, to null effect. And so, it's just really fascinating. I think, that I think it at least in an analogous way, I think that racism is along the same lines. And what I mean by that is, the weight of authority behind the oral law was the fact that it was culturally accepted, and it had time on its side. It came from the elders, right? It had been passed down from generation to generation. So, cultural acceptance, and then the weight of, practice over time. That was the authority behind the oral law, so to speak. Now, of course, when Jesus is referring to traditions, the traditions of men, he's not talking about like traditions in the sense of what we tend to use the word, like, you have a Christmas tradition where everybody goes to grandma's house for dinner, or a Thanksgiving tradition, where so-and-so cuts the turkey, something like that. When we think about traditions, we think about something that we do, just out of habit. But, in this sense, when Jesus is talking about the traditions of men, he's more so talking about something stronger than that, not just something that you do, but something that you're obligated to do based upon the cultural acceptance of such and such a practice or belief, and, the elders having, passed it down from generation to generation. So the oral law was considered to be obligatory, not just something that they did, but something that they had to do. It was pretty much like the ideas, culturally based ideas and obligations that were passed down from generation to generation, right? And in a similar sort of way, I think that's what you have with race. I mean, you have these ideas that are not biblical, that are not grounded in an identity concept that flows from Scripture, infiltrating and taking precedence in people's minds over and above the identity concept that does flow from Scripture. And so whereas, say, maybe back in the the mid I don't know, 17th, 18th century, you had this idea of race coming about, and so rather than the church sticking with, the fact of, Genesis 1:26, we're all made in the image of God, they ingested this idea of this race theory, where, black people are less than, or, people of color in general are less than and not the same as us. Very fascinating, very fascinating. And so in a sense, these ideas that had this cultural weight to it, and even more so now because it has been passed down from generation to generation, and we just accept this race concept without really thinking about it. It's just, the way that things are in our minds. And, this concept, militates against, the identity that is prescribed, for us in scripture, and so in that sense, you have the traditions of man, this race concept, making the word of God to null effect, as in Genesis 1:26, the true identity. And, and just to be clear, I mean, by militate against, the Imago Dei, I don't mean that, just having differences or even, seeing oneself within the context of an ethnicity. I'm not saying that necessarily in and of itself militates against the Imago Dei. But I think that the issue is, as I said before, is that this race concept has, from its inception, been intertwined with concepts of power, value, status, and so forth in society in such a way that it, if not inherently, almost inherently, militates against the Imago Dei, and unfortunately, it's in America and just in the Western world more broadly, that trumping of culture over God's word has had heinous repercussions. Obviously with slavery, lynchings, Jim Crow, Trail of Tears for Native Americans, and I think just I'll leave it at that. So anyway, but yeah, man, aside from the sessions, man, it was just dope catching up with people, man. Lisa Fields was in the building. Shout out to her from Jude 3 podcast. She definitely out there been grinding for the kingdom, man. So it was dope to see her be a part of the Frequency conference and receive an award and whatnot. So, kudos to that. That was definitely what's up. Shout out to Rasul Berry. We've had some interactions online and whatnot. So it was cool to meet him in person. He out there putting in good work. Brother Muhammad Tanzi Moore. Shout out to my brother there. Sho Baraka was in the building, doing his thing, so I got a chance to kick it with him a little bit. That was dope. If y'all hadn't heard the interview I did with him, man, it was definitely one of the most fun interviews I've done so far, here at Tru-ID. So definitely go back and check that out. But it was cool, to be able to catch up with him in person, man, and kick it a little bit. Real humble brother, man. Tore it down on stage. And so that was just real dope. And, oh, shoot, man, definitely shout out to Jerome Gay, man, was in the building. Jerome Gay Jr., Pastor Jerome Gay Jr., and y'all should definitely check him out, man. He's got a show on YouTube called The Urban Perspective. Definitely got a lot of information, man. So definitely check him out. It was cool meeting him in person. That was dope. And my man, Brother Berean was in the building, man. The urban legend, I call it. Everybody knows that cat, man. So Brother Berean, from Berean TV. If you haven't checked him out on YouTube, definitely check him out, Brother Berean. He had a breakout session. I checked that out. He did a great job, did a phenomenal job, kind of going over some of the history of the conscious community. And so I'm definitely going to have him here on the Tru-ID podcast to share some things with y'all, man. He's got a wealth of information. And so it was definitely dope, getting together with him, chopping it up. We did like a 10-minute video towards the end. We've been talking about getting together forever, man. So just to kind of do this 10-minute video, I think it was a big deal, man. Finally got something in. So actually, matter of fact, I'll put the link to that in the description of this episode here, so y'all can check that out. So yeah, definitely check out his channel. And Vocab Malone was in the building. Definitely been doing a lot of work with Vocab Malone over the last year. Vocab Malone was actually the first person that I interviewed for the Tru-ID podcast. A lot of people, obviously Chris Broussard was the first interview I released, but prior to that, I had a interview with Vocab Malone. He was the first guy to respond. So, and it's kind of funny because, when I first started the show, like I said, I called Vocab up, or I hit him up on Facebook rather, and like maybe a couple of days before the show, I heard he didn't like death threats or whatever from Hebrew Israelites, man. So I'm like, yo, I don't even know if I want this cat on my show, man. I ain't about that life. I ain't trying to do all that. You know what I'm saying? I don't need that kind of static, you know. And so then when I see him in Philly, come to find out that, the Hebrews are trying to get at him again, man. They threatened him again, And so we out here kicking it with Vocab. We go to like Chili's, get a bite to eat, you know what I mean? And I think we did like a short video. If I can find that video, I'm gonna post that as well, talking about apologetic stuff. And so, we just kind of, kicking in downtown Philly after one night of the conference. And I was like, man, hold up, man. They got threats out for you this weekend, bro. You got to get from around me, bro. I ain't trying to get caught slipping out here in Philly, dog. You got to go back to the hotel. I'll catch you later. You know what I'm saying? You my dude, but I ain't trying to get caught slipping out here in Philly. So you got to get from around me, bro. I'll catch you tomorrow. So yeah, I was joking with him, halfway joking. I ain't about that life, man. I'm a chill cat, man. I'm laid back. But anyway, it was definitely dope kicking it with Vocab Malone, man. Good to see him in person, and I had a good time with that. I'd say, man, one of the most encouraging, things about the weekend was, a couple times I was in, in between breakout sessions, just kind of hanging out in the hallway, kicking it with Vocab or just different people. And, I'm always talking about apologetics, man. I mean, that's my thing, and as I continue to grow in it, continue to learn, I like to share with other people, because I feel like the more people that we have equipped with this stuff, then the more effective we can be as a body in confronting the issues that are, rising up in the, particularly in the Black community. And so I'm just kicking it with different folks, man, answering questions, about, Kemet, about the Hebrew Israelites, a little bit about the Moors and things like that. And it was cool because on several occasions, I'd be talking about, this or that subject. And then I'm like, yeah, man, you should check out my podcast, the Tru-ID podcast. And it would be like, oh, snap, you're the Tru-ID guy? And I was like, yeah, and they'd be like, oh, man, we was listening to you on the way up here and all this kind of stuff. I met this really, lovely couple from Cleveland. They was like, yo, we was listening to you for like 4 hours on the way up here. And it was like, wow, man, it was just pretty dope, man. It was pretty dope. And just, like I said, just really encouraging, man, knowing that I'm not the only one listening to the show. So, I appreciate you guys out there, man. I'm glad somebody's listening and hopefully receiving from it. And, sometimes I'm recording like 2 or 3 in the morning or later. And it's just good to know that, we being productive out here, man. We doing things at Tru-ID. So, shout out to Dom, shout out to RC, some guys I was kicking it with, and who've been listening to the show. So definitely shout out to you guys and everybody else out there listening. So, no, with that said, I want to end out with this. So, I was talking to some folks between sessions, and a couple tips, that I was covering with them. I just kind of want to leave the show out with that. I mean, coming up on an hour here, so maybe I'll finish it out. Maybe I might just double it up this week, man. I'm charged up after this conference. I might double it up and do a part 2 to this frequency episode here. But so as I was talking to some of the brothers, between sessions, one thing I was really stressing was that the importance of not taking on what we call the burden of proof. All right, that'll be our vocabulary word for the week: the burden of proof. Now, when you're dealing with debates or just some type of dialogue where there's a back and forth, point and counterpoint, the standard rule of debate is that whoever makes the claim has what's called the burden of proof. All right. Now, that's just a way of saying that it's, if you make a statement, if you make a claim, if you claim that something is true, then you have to back it up with evidence. That's really all it really means. Right. And I think so often what happens is when we get into conversations about apologetics is that we're so quick to want to give responses or give answers. Somebody says, Jesus wasn't real. He was a myth based on a horse. We want to get into, there's no parallels, and you want to get into, just really getting into refuting it. Or somebody says, well, Christianity is the white man's religion. We want to jump right on that. And I think that's a mistake, man. I think I may have mentioned it on this show before, but what we really need to do is when somebody makes a claim, make them back it up. Make them back it up. Make them support their claim. Christians aren't, I'll give you a perfect example just to make it plain here, right? So if somebody says, I believe, in, I follow Kemet, Let's go with Kemet, for example. So many times, man, I can't tell you how many times I'll hear somebody support their brother. The ancestors believed, such and such, right? The ancestors believed. Matter of fact, I think I'm just going to go ahead and do a whole show on this. But I mean, that's such poor reasoning as to why, to follow a particular belief system. Well, the ancestors believed it. I mean, so here's the thing, right? Now, obviously, I know that with the conscious community, one of the biggest issues is identity. And so they go looking for belief systems that align with what they believe to be their indigenous identity. Now here's the problem. And, and actually Greg Koukl alluded to this as well a couple of weeks ago, is that, even let's say, for example, if I had a full description of what it is that my ancestors believe, let's say I could trace my lineage back to a particular region, and I knew exactly what they believe. Let's say that I can trace them back to Kemet. Let's go with that, right? Even if it were the case, that I could trace my lineage back and I knew what they believed, that would answer the question of what my ancestors believe. The people where I come from, it would answer the question of what they believe, but it would not answer the question of whether or not what they believe is true. See, I mean, I'd have to go extra step for that. I would know what they believe, but I wouldn't know necessarily whether or not what they believe is true. So the thing is, even if you have, they saying the ancestors believe this or not, okay, well, fine. So, just because the ancestors believed it, why should I believe it? And so just as a matter of, in conversations, when I'm talking with folks, as soon as they go to, well, the ancestors believe such and such, one of the main things that I say is, okay, well, that's great. Now, what evidence do you have that what the ancestors believed is true? Is it actually true? Do you have evidence of that? And see, now I'm getting back into, my Greg Koukl mode, the tactics approach of asking questions to, put the ball in their court, press them with the burden of proof, right? They got to own up to what they claim. Now, the thing of it is, when I ask you the question of, what evidence do you have that, such and such African belief system is true, I don't want to hear, okay, well, this papyrus said this or that, pyramid text said that. I mean, that's all well and good. I need something more than, okay, it was just written down. What evidence do you have that your belief system, whether it be Kemetic or whatever other African religion you want to claim, does it align with reality? That's the question. That's the real question, But yeah, man, we got to start putting the ball back in people's courts. We got to do that rather than putting all the weight of the conversation on us, And, another thing, too, we were talking about is so many times, this is almost a pet peeve of mine, not quite, but almost a pet peeve, is when people in the conscious community, they're so used to bashing Christianity that what I find is that most of them haven't really thought through their own objections to Christianity well enough to realize that some of them cut against the belief systems that they now hold to. So for example, if you're dealing with somebody from Kemet, if you're dealing with somebody, whatever belief system they may hold to, if they believe in God, most of these folks are going to believe in some sort of spiritual being or essence or whatever it may be. If they believe in something, they could say, well, where was Jesus, during the transatlantic slave trade? Well, I could say, well, where was Horus during the transatlantic slave trade? Right? I mean, or whatever God they believe in. They might say, well, Horus never existed. It was just myths or whatever. I believe in, oneness of all creation. Whatever their deity or whatever their higher power is. Where was your higher power during the transatlantic slave trade? See, the reality is this, all belief systems have to grapple with what philosophers call the problem of evil. Obviously we all can look around and see that things are not the way that they ought to be, right? But Christians aren't the only ones who have to give an account, for the problem of evil. Whatever worldview you hold to, you got to answer the same question. Right? I mean, it's just so funny, man. Like, people just, like I said, they don't really think through their objections well enough to realize that they're making objections that actually cut against their own worldview. I mean, people, hit me up like, yeah, man, I pray to the ancestors or I commune with the ancestors. Where was Jesus at during slavery? And it's like, well, wait a minute. You just said you was dealing with the ancestors, right? Where were the ancestors? during the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, you commune with them, right? I mean, shoot, like they could have came around the way and let us know over in Africa that that the Europeans were coming to buy us from our neighbors, and we're gonna be sold into slavery. They could have gave us a heads up, right? Where was they at? Where was Allah? Where was whatever whoever else you want to claim, right? So like I said, people think that these objections just apply to Christianity when they end up cutting really stepping on their own toes, right? And so what we can do then is, like I said, we'll probably have to get into this next time because I'm about to close this show out. But what we can do is, when people raise those objections, then we can give an account from a Christian perspective. That's fine. But I think even before we do that, we need to, you push the objection, back on their end and see how they respond to their own critique, and then go from there. There's a guy named an apologist named Frank Turek, and he calls this the Roadrunner tactic. Because anybody who remembers the Roadrunner back in the day, he would run off a cliff and kind of be standing in midair and then fall like after a couple seconds like that. So he calls this this idea of taking someone's critique or criticism against Christianity and then flipping it back on them, calls it the Roadrunner tactic, because it kind of pulls the rug from under their objection. But it's just so interesting to me, man. So interesting. Perfect example, I believe, with this. I was dealing with this guy. He's a Hebrew Israelite on Facebook, and he made this long argument about Jesus didn't exist because he's a Torah only Hebrew Israelite. Which I think that's a minority of them that are just hold to the Old Testament. So anyway, he's talking about Jesus didn't exist, and one of his critiques was that there were no supposedly, according to him, there were no eyewitness accounts of Jesus. Now, first of all, that's definitely false, and we can get into 1 Corinthians 15 verses 1 through 8 to refute that, or just a plethora of other ways you can address it. But let's just say for sake of argument that that's a valid critique. Now, if that's the case, if you're saying that Jesus didn't exist because you don't have eyewitness testimony, reliable eyewitness testimony, then the same thing would apply to every figure in the Old Testament that I can think of. Right? I mean, it would apply to them too. It's just, that criteria is just bogus. You know what I'm saying? So it makes absolutely no sense, because now you're cutting against your own belief system just to spite Christianity. Now, I think we have good reason to affirm, that folks, both in the New and the Old Testament existed. We'll probably do a whole show on that. But my point is that his objection cut against his own belief system, and he didn't realize it until I pointed it out. Right. So, anyway, man, just kind of keep that in mind, man. When you're dealing with people just in the conscious community, kind of be on the lookout for those objections to Christianity that you can kind of just, toss back their way. Because what happens is, if you can do that, then they're no longer arguing with you. They got to argue with themselves. They have to argue with their own objection before they can even deal with, the information that you want to put on the table. So, but anyway, man, let me get up out of here, yo. I'm just kind of feeling nostalgic, man. It's been about a year since I, started this show, and matter of fact, I think what I might do, man, I might the intro song to this show is actually a song from one of my old mixtapes, man. I might go ahead and just tack it on at the end of this episode just for nostalgia's sake, But either way, man, love y'all. Until next time, that's another episode in the books. Peace.
Woo! Trying to find my way, 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 trying to find my way. I'm trying, change me.
My faith is in God alone, beyond a reasonable doubt. This brainstorm, pouring rain on your season of drought. Just trying to lay a couple seeds in the mouth. Thanks for listening. You ever get the feeling you was missing it? Like maybe if somebody took the time to look past your surface, past what you display at your routine church service. They see the real you, severely malnourished, who's beating off religion, not genuine worship. Ooh, can't front, man, I've been there too. It's so easy to get it confused, but I learned this truth. God want more than servitude. He the most high, yet he a person too. I mean, he want things personal between you and him, you and God, both of you in the sin. That's why he came to free you from sin. Lord, I pray, please renew us again. Amen.
Trying to find my way, I'm just trying to find find my way home. Trying to find my way. Just trying to find my way. Trying to find my way.
Being real on this, man.
Just trying to find my way home.
Put my life out, just hope it bless y'all.
Trying to change me.
I was stressed out, feeling like the world's on my shoulders. Laid back with some cheese curls and a soda. About then I heard a word from Jehovah. I realized I can't change the world from my sofa. Cut off the video game, let go of the controller. Picked up the pencil and let these words flow from the heart. That's why what you getting is real. Guess the story ain't done cause I'm living it still. I see the minds of the masses is limited still. Missing his will, but I ain't got a minute to kill. So I'm playing life like piano keys. If this the Matrix, I feel like Keanu Reeves. Think about it each time you breathe. That's a blessing. This life's like a vapor that passes in a second. I'm trying to be with Ric Flair, it's the wrestling, a veteran. My goal is spread the kingdom of heaven. Come on.
I'm just trying to find my way. Just trying to find my way home.
Trying to find it, man.
Trying to find my way.
It's like I can hear that heart.
Trying to find my way. Trying to find my way home. Trying to find my way home.
You gotta tell them the truth, they stay lost, you know?
Trying change.
They say the pen is mightier than the sword. That's why I write and record. Fighting the swarms of lies we were forced to believe by this world system. Lord, please make this world listen. I'm in the eye of the storm. Let's see the fight and conform. Father God, I ignore him and I refuse to be inside of the norm. Upper world to say it's cool to kill a child unborn. Sometimes I feel torn. Shall I smile or mourn? When there's so much going on that needs our attention. Compassion through action is Jesus' vision. The world doesn't need your religion. It needs God's love. You can be the extension of his heart. I know it gets hard. Just look at the news. On the streets it's still beef between the Bloods and the Blues. Overseas it's all the same. It's just the Muslims and Jews. Cause they've been trained for jihad since knee high. But me, I've been learning that true Caesar love has grown. When somebody else's burden becomes your own. Sometimes I feel like we almost home. But until I'm gone, we gon' be chanting to the words of the song. And I don't care if they say lame with the small time. Or if I go down as the greatest of all time. I came to let God shine. It's his life now. So I'm trying to make worship a lifestyle. It's my heart, man.
Just trying to find my way. I'm just trying to find my way home. Just trying to find my way. I'm just trying to find my way. I'm trying to find my way. I'm just trying to find my way home. I'm trying. Please change me. Change me.
Lord, just change us.
Change me.
I need you, God.
No longer can be the same. Don't wanna be the same no more. Change me. Can I be the same no more? Change me.
Trying to be like you.
Trying.
Jesus.
Change me.
Scott Lane signing out. Ty Francis. Good looking out, man.
God, I'm trying.
Scott Lane signing out. Yo, champion.
Let me find my way.
G.I. see you.
Find my way. Change